Well, we certainly hear a lot about it, and then events happen around the world that help thrust it back into the spotlight. We're talking about terrorism. And we have a special guest this half hour to help us understand the lay of the land as it relates to that, and in particular, Homeland Security Law Programs, in fact. Michael McDaniel is a retired brigadier general and now a professor and director of Homeland Security Programs at the WMU Cooley Law School, and he joins us this morning. Professor, good morning.
Good morning, Richard.
Thank you very much for the time today.
My pleasure entirely. Glad to be on your show.
Let's, before we get into the subject, let's talk a little bit about what your experience has been and how you ended up at Cooley Law.
Sure. I was part-time in the National Guard most of my career, working for the State Attorney General's office. After 9/11, I headed a task force on behalf of Governor Engler and Attorney General Granholm to look at Michigan law and say, where are the gaps in our law now that we have this idea of terror attacks in the United States? Michigan did not even have an anti-terrorism statute, did not make terrorism a crime at that point. So the task force made up of both Democrats and Republicans, attorneys across state government and state police. We looked at that. We came up with 36 pieces of legislation. The Michigan legislature passed 34 of those. The result of that, when Attorney General Granholm became governor, she made me her Homeland Security advisor. I did that for 6 years, and then I went to the Pentagon as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Homeland Defense Planning, where certainly put my legal skills to work, even though I was not in the General Counsel's office, but was involved in long-term planning against terror attacks in the United States. I did that for 2 years, came back when Cooley asked me to start a program on Homeland Security Law. I was very gratified that they did, and that program is now up and running and has been for about 3 or 4 years.
When we talk about Homeland Security Law, what does that really mean? I mean, what is the main focus, the main concern of that?
You know, that's a great question because it's a very, very broad issue. It's everything from immigration law and some fields that pre-existed 9/11 and our massive new legislation that we had starting in early 2002 to specific counterterrorism measures, again, which pre-existed 9/11, such as how we prosecute those that we believe are engaged in acts of terrorism or, more likely, material support for terrorists in this country. But it also includes then a look at some of the over 100 laws that have been passed to deal with Homeland Security and counterterrorism just in the last 10 to 15 years. You know, we focus on the Patriot Act. We focus on those acts that have an effect on U.S. businesses, like changes in customs. We focus on the Safety Act and the need to protect critical infrastructure, and anything that has an impact on U.S. businesses or citizens as a result of our new focus on counterterrorism in the United States.
All right, and when we come back in a minute, we'll try and understand what the risks are these days now that there have been a number of years that have passed since our, I suppose you could call it, domestic terrorism awakening. And we'll discuss this more in just a moment on WBCK. 8:15 WBCK. We're talking with Professor Michael McDaniel, who's in charge of Homeland Security Programs at the WMU Cooley Law School and has had a career in this area, Homeland Security Law. So, Professor, how would you characterize the threat that terrorism presents to the homeland now in the years that we've had this realization since 2001 that it can happen here?
Richard, that's a great question because there's been an evolution of our understanding of terrorism. Obviously, when we first started this massive refocusing within the U.S. government towards terrorism and the switch of the FBI, for example, from organized crime to terror groups, we focused on Al-Qaeda, obviously. And as we are starting to realize now, Al-Qaeda is vastly different from many of the other groups that we have now, and that both of them sort of represent a focus on or a carrying out of an ideology, the Wahhabist ideology, but in different ways. You know, Al-Qaeda wanted to sort of export that ideology in a very ascetic, almost austere, almost solely religious means, whereas ISIS is much more focused on seizing territory and not looking at the caliphate of the future at the point of the apocalypse like Al-Qaeda, but looking at building that caliphate now and doing so locally through murdering other Muslim groups such as the Shia and trying to recruit support and fighters to sort of hold that territory from around the world. And so it is a much different look there. And the big point, though, is that the U.S. is starting to realize that you can't focus on Al-Qaeda. You have to focus on the underlying ideology, and our means of attacking that has to differ depending on the type of group and the manifestation that we see of the ideology among the different groups.
Mm-hmm.
So, and one of the points I think that you mentioned, Richard, that I really didn't address is that domestic piece and the fear of it coming to the United States. I would say that it is much, much less than you would expect in Western Europe. Quite simply, what the U.S. has done well is assimilate, not just accept, but assimilate various immigrant groups into this country. One way to look at it is that there are estimates that only about 100 U.S. kids have tried to travel to the Syria-Iraq region to join up with ISIS or other groups such as al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda group in Syria. Whereas the number for France is somewhere around 600 to 700. UK is almost that high. Germany is almost that high. Belgium is around 350 to 400 kids that are known to have done so. Again, much higher proportion of their population than you would see in the United States, and that's because they don't accept, assimilate, and treat these immigrants as their own citizens, like we do in the United States.
What do you make of some of the chatter out there right now that is being credited to Donald Trump that a registry of Muslims is necessary?
Well, obviously, I think it's anti-American. I mean, we have, our First Amendment rights include the free exercise clause, and I obviously think that to do so, for that level, any level of government involvement in religion, I think is abhorrent to U.S. citizens and should remain so. I mean, there have been other religious groups, most notably the Jews in the 1930s, coming to the U.S. There was a backlash or fear of them doing so then. Obviously, that's worked out very well. And we have many Muslim citizens. We are lucky in Michigan, I think, because of our large Muslim population in the Dearborn area. And I think any sort of registration is just contrary to what this country's best values are.
Let me ask you this, though. Is it legally possible the way the laws are written now?
If you're talking about looking at data on immigrants to the United States, you could track that, I suppose, in terms of one data set that you are keeping.
Right.
But to try and register U.S. citizens, homegrown U.S. citizens, who have every right to be here, who are not coming to this country from another country, no, I don't think so.
Okay. We're talking with the chair of the Homeland Security Programs at the WMU Cooley Law School. When we come back in a minute, how does the purview of Homeland Security law consider Battle Creek, for example, a place where there are federal installations? We'll talk about that coming up. WBCK, we're talking with the retired Brigadier General Michael McDaniel. He's now Director of Homeland Security Programs at the WMU Cooley Law School, and we're talking about the issue of terrorism. You know, there's been some reaction quickly after the attacks in Paris to stop or somehow study further the Syrian refugee issue. Let's talk about that a little bit, Professor, if you don't mind. What are your impressions of that situation?
Well, first, there's about 4 million Syrian refugees, those that have fled Syria, actually left the country. There's many more than that have been displaced by the civil war. But 4 million Syrians have fled the country. Almost all of those are still in the Middle East, with about 1 million of them being in Lebanon, which is a destabilization to that country, a country we don't want really destabilized anymore. So of that, there have been about 2,000 that have been in the process for consideration in the United States, 2,000 out of 4 million. And that process takes about 18 months. It can take as long as 3 years. And there is a different process or an added step to the process for Syrian refugees. What CIS and DHS does is they have an initial review called the Syrian Enhanced Review Process, sort of a pre-screening screening, where once they get the application, and the application has to be from a potential refugee that is still in the Middle East. We have not considered anyone that has moved out of the Middle East into Europe, for example. We're looking mostly at those that are in Turkey or Jordan, which are the two strongest allies of the United States in that region other than Israel. So we only look at those, and then we do this initial review of their application, find out who they know, where they live, occupations, all that sort of thing, so that when we do the interview process, and the interview process means that we have U.S. officials going to where they are and then interviewing them at length. So it's you verify the family stories, you verify their identity, you verify they have no connections to any criminal activity, much less terrorist organizations, and you do that based upon the information that you've already gathered about them. So it is, as I said, a very in-depth process. The number one criteria is still that they already have family members in the United States. As I said, all applicants are vetted in the Middle East, and it is a very selective process. I think it's very, very unlikely that you would have any sort of terrorist sort of masquerading as a Syrian refugee through this process, which starts with the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, has to have sort of that endorsement before they even get an application for the United States, and then goes to this extremely long process where we're scrutinizing that family. So I think that's very unlikely. I think more likely would be foreign fighters, kids from the U.S. returning here from the Middle East, or those coming into the country illegally. And I think that's where the efforts of our political candidates, our Congress should be debating right now, is how we can sort of look at that potential threat.
Okay. Before you go, let's talk about our own town here, Battle Creek, which has federal installations here. There's discussion of potentially a missile defense system being situated here. Does that put us, from the perspective of Homeland Security observing and Homeland Security law, does that put us on a hot list of potential targets?
It could. I would take being on such a list to be a good thing, because that means that we have raised Battle Creek to the level of the other cities that we know to be on the list, such as New York City, Chicago, Miami. So I think that if and cities that are near large military bases. So I applaud the efforts of Battle Creek Unlimited, the efforts of the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, this outreach, this very successful outreach to the federal government for all the efforts that we have there. I certainly worked with the Defense Logistics Agency when I was in the Pentagon. So this is really a great thing that's happening in Battle Creek, and that makes it a great place to have a program in Homeland Security, frankly. So I think that this is a huge step forward, and there will be an increase in risk, but it is one that can be addressed and mitigated. So I am not concerned about that at all.
Well, we appreciate the time you've given us today, and I think we've only scratched the surface, but I expect we'll have a chance to talk again.
I look forward to it, Richard, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Retired Brigadier General Michael McDaniel, WMU Cooley Law School Professor and Director of Homeland Security Programs.